Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories, my beautiful YouTube family. I'm beyond excited to have each and every one of you here today, and I'm so grateful to share these amazing stories with you all. Here we come together to experience thrilling adventures, heartwarming moments, and life lessons that remind us of what truly matters: family, love, and connection. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications, so you'll always be here to share in our family's next adventure. Grab your loved ones, settle in, and let's dive into another story that'll touch your heart and leave you with something special. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being part of this family. I love you all, and I can't wait to share today's story with you. It was a golden afternoon in New York City. The streets were alive with energy, the honking of cars, the chatter of busy pedestrians, and the constant hum of the city's never-ending pulse. Jack Masters, the self-made millionaire and CEO of a rapidly growing tech company, had long become accustomed to the city's pace. His days were filled with endless meetings, conference calls, and constant decision-making. Yet there were times, rare moments, when even he felt the need to step away from the chaos and breathe. Today was one of those rare days. With his ever-present suit and neatly combed hair, Jack walked into one of his favorite spots, a well-known restaurant tucked away on a quiet street. It was a place where time seemed to slow down. The dim lighting and rustic wooden tables gave off a calm, inviting atmosphere that Jack cherished. The aroma of fresh bread and roasting meats filled the air. For the first time in what felt like ages, Jack simply wanted to enjoy a peaceful meal by himself. No business calls, no obligations, just a break, a moment of solitude. He stepped up to the hostess stand, where a young woman with a bright smile greeted him. "Table for one, Mr. Masters?" she asked politely, recognizing him instantly. Jack nodded, slipping out of his jacket, his shoulders easing as he felt the weight of the corporate world momentarily lift. The hostess led him through the restaurant, navigating the bustling area with ease until they reached a small booth in the back corner. It was a perfect spot for someone who wanted to unwind without being disturbed. Jack slid into the booth, letting out a soft breath as he looked at the menu. He hadn't had time to truly enjoy a meal in what seemed like weeks, but today was different. Or so he thought. As he sat there, scanning the menu, his mind started to wander. He thought about his company, the challenges ahead, the next big deal. But then something caught his attention. He felt it before he even saw them. An odd sense of familiarity, a presence that seemed to call out to him. His eyes moved instinctively toward the corner booth near the window, and there they were. Emily, his ex-wife. Jack's heart stopped for a beat, and everything around him seemed to fade into the background. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the buzz of conversation disappeared. All that remained was Emily, sitting there in the soft light of the window, looking every bit as beautiful as he remembered. The years between them seemed to dissolve in an instant. Her hair, still long and dark, cascaded past her shoulders. Her features had softened, but her smile was the same, gentle and warm, like it always was when they were in love. Jack stood frozen, unsure if he was imagining things. He hadn't seen Emily in over 5 years. Their divorce had been painful, an emotional roller coaster that had left scars. She had walked away, and Jack had thrown himself into his career. He hadn't reached out to her since that day. The years apart had turned their once intimate bond into nothing more than a distant memory, one he had locked away, unwilling to revisit. But here she was, sitting with two children who were staring at him with wide eyes. Jack's chest tightened. His gaze moved from Emily to the children sitting across from her. The boy, no older than 8, had tousled dark hair and a mischievous grin. The girl, perhaps a little younger, had soft curls framing her delicate face. But what struck Jack the most, what made his heart skip a beat, was how much they looked like him. The boy's eyes, the same shade of green Jack had seen in the mirror his entire life. The girl's smile, it was his smile, the same curve of the lips that had once charmed Emily. For a long moment, Jack simply stared at them. His mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest. Was it possible? Could these children be his? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Could he be a father? The idea seemed too surreal. It didn't make sense. How could he have children and yet not know about them? A rush of emotions swelled in his chest, and his hands began to tremble slightly. Could it really be true? Was it fate or just a coincidence? His stomach churned as a wave of confusion washed over him. Emily caught his gaze, and, for a split second, there was a flicker of something deeper than just surprise. Was it guilt, regret? Or perhaps it was simply the shared history between them resurfacing, unspoken yet undeniable. Emily's eyes softened, and she stood up from the table, her hand resting on the arm of the boy. The girl, still hesitant, looked from Emily to Jack with curiosity. "Jack," she said softly, her voice steady, yet laced with a quiet sadness. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, but I suppose this is fate, isn't it?" Jack swallowed hard. Fate. Was that what this was? He hadn't been looking for her, hadn't even thought of her in recent years, but now she was right in front of him with these two children who, against all odds, seemed to belong to him. His breath caught in his throat, and he tried to compose himself, to push past the shock that had seized him. He needed answers, but more than anything, he needed to understand what was happening. Why were they here? Why hadn't she told him? "Emily, What is this? Who are they?" Jack asked, his voice thick with emotion. The words felt foreign, as though they were coming from someone else. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the twins. Emily's face tightened, and she gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "These are your children, Jack." The world seemed to stop spinning. Jack's breath caught in his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The words hit him like a freight train, and he felt the floor beneath him shift. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind raced as he struggled to process the truth. His children, the twins, how could it be? Jack tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind was overwhelmed by a million questions. How long had they been his children? Why hadn't Emily told him? The shock was so intense, so immediate, that Jack felt his knees weaken. He had lived his entire adult life focused on his career, his ambitions. Had he really been so blind to the family he might have had? It took everything in him to stay grounded, to stay composed. But he couldn't deny the truth any longer. These children, his children, were standing right in front of him. And as their gazes met, Jack realized that this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was something far bigger. It was destiny calling him home. 5 years had passed since the day Jack and Emily stood in that sterile courtroom, their hands trembling as they signed the divorce papers. The words, irreconcilable differences, had never felt so real. Jack had always been a man of ambition, driven by an insatiable desire for success. He had spent countless hours in meetings, making deals, and building the empire he had always dreamed of. But in the process, he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: his family. At the beginning, things had been different. Jack had been a devoted husband, attentive and caring. He and Emily had a love that seemed unbreakable, a bond that felt as if it could withstand anything life threw their way. They had been a team, building a life together, but over time the cracks began to show. Jack's work had become all-consuming. His office was his sanctuary, his meetings were his escape, and every new deal, every success, was another fleeting moment of validation that he so desperately sought. Emily, once his partner in everything, was left to deal with the void he had created in their relationship. Emily had tried for a long time to be patient. She had given him the space to grow, to chase his dreams, hoping that one day he would realize what was slipping through his fingers. She had sacrificed her own ambitions to support his, putting her career on hold to focus on their home, their life together, and their future. She had built the home, raised the dinners, taken care of the bills, and handled every little detail of their lives. But as time went on, the emotional distance between them only grew wider. Jack's presence in their home had become almost invisible. She would sit across from him at the dinner table speaking about their day, but he would only nod, distracted by his phone, his laptop, or the thoughts running through his head about his next business move. The loneliness began to eat away at Emily. She missed the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once made her feel like the most important person in his world. But that man was no longer there. Jack had become consumed by his ambition, leaving no space for her, for their family. The quiet nights, the missed anniversaries, the emotional emptiness that had become a part of their life together. Each of these moments left a scar on Emily's heart. And as the years went by, Emily realized that if she stayed, she would only be prolonging the inevitable. She had tried to talk to him, to explain how she felt. But Jack was always too busy. He had built his empire, but at what cost? Their connection had eroded beyond repair. Emily was no longer just a wife. She had become a ghost in their marriage, someone Jack only noticed when it was convenient, someone he failed to truly see. And so, when Emily had finally made the painful decision to leave, Jack hadn't been able to comprehend the depth of her pain. He had been so wrapped up in his success, so consumed by his own world, that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. The divorce was messy. There were arguments, moments of bitterness, and too many unanswered questions. Jack had fought to keep things civil, not wanting to lose everything. But in the end, the damage was done. Emily walked away, taking nothing but her dignity and the quiet hope that someday she would find happiness again. Jack, on the other hand, was left behind, his life suddenly devoid of the woman who had been his rock for so many years. For a while, Jack was lost. His company was thriving, yes, but there was a hollow ache in his chest, an emptiness that no amount of money or success could fill. The loneliness was deafening. He tried to throw himself deeper into his work, thinking that maybe if he just kept building, kept achieving, it would distract him from the emptiness he felt inside. But nothing worked. The nights were long, and the days felt like an endless cycle of meetings, phone calls, and deadlines. There was no joy in it anymore. The applause of his business world felt shallow, the praise empty. Without Emily by his side, there was no true sense of fulfillment. The hardest part was the silence. Emily had become a distant memory, someone he rarely thought about, but someone who still lingered in the corners of his mind. He had heard rumors that she had moved on, found someone new, and was living her life. At first, Jack had resisted the thought, telling himself that he was better off focusing on his company, but deep down he knew the truth. He had lost the love of his life, and there was no going back. Over the years, Jack had occasionally heard from mutual friends that Emily had remarried or had begun a new life. He couldn't bring himself to ask directly. He had been too proud, too focused on his own path, and the idea of her moving on was too painful to confront. So, he simply buried the thought and carried on, pretending that he was fine, convincing himself that his success was enough. But in the quiet moments, when he wasn't surrounded by the noise of business, Jack would often think of Emily. He would remember the way she smiled, the way her laugh had made the world seem a little bit brighter. He would think of the way they used to walk through Central Park together, talking about their dreams, their hopes for the future. He missed those moments. He missed her. But by then it was too late. She had moved on, and Jack was left with the remnants of a marriage that had crumbled in front of him, unnoticed, until it was too late. Jack tried to convince himself that he was better off without her, that his achievements were a fair trade for the void left in his heart. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was a part of him that would always be empty. He'd built an empire, but it felt more like a fortress, one that kept everyone, even himself, at a distance. No amount of money or accolades could replace the warmth of Emily's touch, the comfort of her voice. And as the years passed, Jack began to understand something he had never truly grasped before. Success without love, without the people who matter most, was hollow. The emptiness grew over the years, settling like a weight on Jack's chest that no amount of success could lift. At first, the distractions of his business kept him busy enough to ignore the quiet ache that lingered in his soul. But slowly, the truth started to settle in. Emily had been the foundation of everything. She had given him the stability, the love, and the support he had taken for granted. Without her, Jack had become a shell of the man he used to be. His empire felt like a house of cards, impressive from the outside, but fragile at its core. He had convinced himself that being alone was just a phase, that eventually he would learn to live without her. But the longer he spent in his lavish office, surrounded by wealth and power, the more he realized that all the things he had accumulated couldn't fill the void. His mind would often drift back to the early days of their relationship, when Emily's laughter filled their apartment, when their plans for the future seemed limitless. Those were the moments he wished he could turn back to, but time was unforgiving. And in the years since their separation, the regret had only deepened. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all his achievements, he had lost the most important thing of all: love. Jack took a few tentative steps forward, his heart pounding with every beat. The noise of the bustling restaurant seemed to fade into the background, his focus entirely on Emily and the children. His eyes were locked on the twins. Every second felt like a lifetime, and yet time seemed to stretch indefinitely as Jack's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The world around him was a blur, but the image of those two children, so strikingly familiar, had his attention like nothing else. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew them. The boy, his messy dark hair and the vibrant, almost mischievous green eyes were unmistakable. Those eyes, that unmistakable shade of green, the one Jack had inherited from his mother, the very same eyes that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. His pulse quickened. The boy was a mirror image of him at that age. It was as if someone had taken his younger self and brought him to life, sitting right there at the table. But it was the girl who really made his heart race. She had a smile that sent a shockwave of nostalgia through Jack's chest, a smile so similar to his own. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was like looking at a reflection of his childhood. The curve of her lips, the way her eyes softened when she smiled. He couldn't deny it anymore. They looked like his children, his own flesh and blood. Could they really be mine? He thought, the words echoing in his head like a haunting refrain. Every instinct inside him screamed that they were, but he couldn't comprehend how that could be possible. The weight of the realization hit him like a tidal wave, but before he could process it further, Emily looked up. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the entire world seemed to stand still. Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air between them like an invisible thread. Emily's eyes widened as recognition washed over her. The surprise on her face was mixed with something else. A flicker of guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the shock of seeing him after all these years. She hadn't expected him to walk in here today. She hadn't expected to face the man who had once been everything to her. Jack took another step toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily?" His voice wavered, carrying a blend of excitement, confusion, and a deep longing he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. The name felt foreign on his tongue, as if it belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. But it was hers, the woman he had once loved so deeply, and seeing her now was like stepping back into a part of his life that he had buried long ago. "Jack?" Emily's voice was soft but laced with surprise, her eyebrows furrowing as she rose slightly from her seat. The way she said his name was almost like an echo from the past, sending ripples through Jack's memories. He had missed the sound of it, missed hearing her voice call out to him in the way only she could. What are you doing here?" she asked, her words hesitant, though there was no mistaking the edge of shock in her tone. Jack could see that she, too, was caught off guard by the unexpected encounter. The past 5 years seemed to resurface in a rush, the unfinished chapters of their lives reaching out to them in this single fateful moment. I didn't expect to see you, Emily. I didn't expect to see them." Jack's voice trembled with emotion, the weight of the truth almost too much to bear. He couldn't stop staring at the children. The boy, the girl, his children, sitting right there in front of him. The revelation seemed surreal, impossible, but the proof was undeniable. His heart raced faster, and his mind was swirling with questions, each one more urgent than the last. Why hadn't she told him? How had this happened? Emily stood still for a moment, her expression unreadable, before her eyes shifted briefly to the twins. She then looked back at Jack, her face softening. "Jack, I didn't think you would ever show up like this." There was a hint of sorrow in her voice, mixed with the quiet uncertainty of everything that had transpired between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack's gaze lingered on the twins, who were now looking at him with wide eyes, unsure of what to make of the situation. The boy's curious stare was piercing, and the girl's expression mirrored her brother's, both of them confused, unsure of who this stranger was. The tension in the air felt suffocating, as if the weight of the years between them had collapsed into this one moment. Jack opened his mouth to speak again, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? What was there to say after everything that had happened? But then, as if to break the silence, the boy, his son, Jack realized, spoke. "Who are you?" The question was simple, innocent, but it sent a shock of realization through Jack. The boy's voice was filled with curiosity, and it was a voice he hadn't expected to hear in his life, a voice that belonged to his flesh and blood. Before Jack could respond, the girl piped up too, her voice soft and tentative. Are you my dad?" Her eyes were filled with an innocence that broke Jack's heart, and in that moment, the truth hit him harder than ever. These were his children. They had been right under his nose all this time, and he hadn't known. The rush of emotions, shock, disbelief, excitement, and guilt flooded through him. Jack's eyes met Emily's, and there was no hiding the pain in her gaze. She had raised them on her own. She had kept this secret for years, and Jack had never even known. "I didn't know," Jack finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. His chest felt tight, as if the weight of everything he hadn't been a part of in their lives was pressing down on him all at once. Emily's eyes softened, but there was also a trace of sadness. "I didn't know how to tell you, Jack. You were so focused on your work. I thought it was best to let you go." Her words were quiet, but there was a deep, lingering truth in them. It was the truth of the years that had passed, the years of silence between them. Jack looked at the twins again, his heart aching, his children, the children he never knew he had. Jack's heart felt as though it might burst from his chest. The reality of the situation seemed too overwhelming to process, yet it was all so painfully clear. His mind raced through every moment of the last 5 years. How many milestones, how many birthdays, how many first steps he had missed. He had been so blinded by his ambition, by the rush of success, that he had failed to see what truly mattered. His children, his family had been there all along, waiting for him to notice. But now, in this quiet moment, there was no turning back. The regret that gripped him was suffocating, a weight he didn't know how to shake off. The twins stared at him with innocent eyes, their faces a mirror of his own, and a wave of guilt surged through him. He had built this empire, this world of wealth and power, but at what cost? They had grown up without him, without their father. They were strangers to him, and yet there was a deep, undeniable connection that pulled at his heart. The love he had for them was instant, raw, and real. But how could he make up for all the time lost, for all the moments that could never be reclaimed? Emily's voice cut through his thoughts, soft but firm. "Jack, it's been too long. I don't expect you to just step in and fix everything. But you have to understand, they've had to grow up without you, and I've had to be both mother and father to them." Her words were laced with a mixture of hurt and strength, the pain of years of sacrifice and the burden of raising their children alone. Jack wanted to say something, to apologize, to make it all right, but the words seemed so insignificant compared to the reality before him. How could he explain the years he had spent building a life that had no true meaning without them? How could he undo the damage caused by his absence? Jack felt the world around him spin as Emily stood up from her seat, her movements almost deliberate, as though she were preparing herself for something monumental. Her face softened, her expression a mix of warmth and apprehension, but her eyes betrayed the tension beneath the surface. The years of separation, the pain of their broken marriage, and the weight of everything unspoken seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. It was almost as if time itself had stopped, and the only thing that mattered in this moment was the truth that was about to be revealed. "Jack, ... Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'd like you to meet your children." The words struck him like a physical blow, the impact of them leaving him breathless. Jack blinked, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. "My children." The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, his voice laced with disbelief. The very idea seemed impossible. He had always believed that Emily had moved on, that their past was something she had buried and left behind, just as he had buried his regrets. But this was something completely different. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment he felt as though he were drowning in the weight of it all. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze steady but heavy with unspoken words. She glanced at the twins, and Jack followed her gaze, his eyes locking onto the two children who were still sitting at the table. His breath caught in his throat as he looked at them again, seeing them in a new light. The boy's green eyes were unmistakable, and the girl's smile, it was the same smile Jack had worn when he was their age. A surge of emotions flooded through him. His heart ached, his mind raced, and everything around him seemed to blur as he tried to comprehend the truth that was unfolding before him. "Emily, how could you not tell me?" Jack finally managed to say, his voice raw with confusion and hurt. There was a flood of emotions that he couldn't contain, and the rush of those feelings made it difficult to focus. The world felt like it was crumbling around him, yet it was all so surreal. Emily took a deep breath and looked down, as though gathering her thoughts before she could speak. "Jack, it was never my intention to hurt you. After the divorce, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to bring up the past or the pain. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just kept them away from you." Her words came slowly, carefully, as though she had rehearsed them in her mind 1,000 times, but they still felt raw and full of emotion. Jack's mind spun with disbelief. He had spent 5 years building a life for himself, working harder than ever, but he had never known that Emily had been raising their children in secret. He hadn't even known they existed. How had he missed this? The idea that he had been oblivious to their presence in the world, to the fact that he had children out there, was too much to bear. His heart clenched as a new wave of guilt hit him. He had never once thought of what Emily had gone through after their separation. She had carried this burden alone, raising his children in silence, never giving him the chance to be a part of their lives. Jack turned his gaze to Sarah and Noah once more. Sarah, the girl who had reminded him of his own smile, was now looking at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Noah, the boy who had his eyes, was studying him intently, as if trying to make sense of the stranger standing before them. The two children, his children, were looking at him as if they were trying to figure out who this man was, this man who was supposed to be their father, but was nothing more than a stranger to them. His chest tightened as he realized the magnitude of what he had lost. These were the moments he could never get back. The first steps, the first words, the school plays, the scraped knees and the bedtime stories. These were the things Emily had done alone, without him, and now he was faced with the consequence of his absence. The pain of that realization was suffocating. Emily continued, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jack. I knew how much you loved your work. I knew you wouldn't be able to balance it all. And I didn't want you to feel burdened by the responsibility of being a father when you were already so focused on your career. So I made the decision to raise them on my own. I didn't want to remind you of the life you had lost." Her voice cracked, and Jack could see the years of sacrifice, of silently shouldering everything alone, etched into the lines of her face. The weight of her words was crushing, and Jack felt his heart break all over again. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The enormity of everything that had just been revealed felt overwhelming. How could Emily have kept this from him? How had she raised 2 children on her own, never once asking for his help, never once telling him about their existence? But as the question hung in the air, Jack realized something else too. He wasn't the only one who had suffered. Emily had carried this secret, this burden by herself for all these years, and in her eyes he saw the deep well of pain, of love lost and hope shattered. "I never wanted this to be hard for you, Jack. I just wanted them to grow up happy, to grow up with love, and I never wanted you to feel pressured to be something you weren't ready to be." Emily's voice softened, but there was a quiet strength in her words. She had carried this weight for so long, and now, in the quiet moment of this revelation, Jack saw the woman who had never given up on their children, who had never let go of the love they once shared, even though he had. The twins, Noah and Sarah, were still watching him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Jack took a deep breath, his chest tight with the weight of everything he had just learned. There was so much to process, so much he had missed. But one thing was painfully clear. His life had changed forever in this moment. The children he had never known existed were standing before him. And no matter what had happened between him and Emily, they were his responsibility now. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, his voice filled with a grief he couldn't fully express. It was the only thing he could say, but even those words felt too small, too insignificant in the face of everything he had lost. The twins' eyes softened, and though they didn't fully understand the significance of the moment, Jack knew that they were looking at him with hope, a hope that he would finally be the father they had never known. Jack stood there, his chest tight with a mix of regret and longing. He wanted to reach out, to hold them, to apologize for the years lost, but he didn't know where to begin. The silence stretched on, and in that silence, a bond began to form, fragile but real. Sarah and Noah were his children, and though it was late, the moment felt like a second chance, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Emily's gaze softened as she watched Jack struggle, her heart aching for him, but also understanding that this was their beginning, not their end. Jack felt as though he were on the edge of a precipice, his emotions swirling around him in a chaotic whirlwind. His chest tightened with an overwhelming rush of guilt and disbelief. For so long, he had been consumed by his career, building his empire, believing that success and wealth were the only things that could fill the void in his life. He had been so focused on what was in front of him that he failed to see what was missing. And now, standing in front of him were the two most important people he had never known, his children. How had he missed this? How had he spent so many years thinking he was fulfilled, when in truth he had a family out there waiting for him? He felt like he had been living in a dream, and now the harsh light of reality was hitting him all at once, and it was impossible to escape. Every fiber of his being screamed in regret. The years that had passed, the moments he could never get back, seemed to stretch infinitely before him. There was no erasing the past, no undoing the mistakes. But there they were, Sarah and Noah, his children, flesh and blood. He had spent so many years being a stranger to them, and now they were sitting right in front of him, unsure of who he was, and yet somehow they shared a piece of him. The twins sat across from Jack, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Sarah, the girl, was quiet, her eyes wide as she took in the stranger who claimed to be her father. Her lips were pursed slightly, as though she were trying to make sense of the man sitting across from her. Noah, her twin, was no different. His green eyes, so much like Jack's, flickered with uncertainty, his little fingers gripping the edge of his chair. The resemblance between them was uncanny. There was no mistaking that they were his children. Jack could see his own reflection in their faces, and the weight of that truth hit him like a freight train. "Hey there," Jack said softly, his voice shaky as he tried to break the ice. He forced a smile, though it felt unfamiliar on his face. He didn't know what to say, how to bridge the gap between them, but he had to start somewhere. I know this must be really confusing, but I'm Jack. I'm your dad." The words felt strange to say out loud, like they didn't quite belong in his mouth. He wasn't sure how to do this, how to be the father they deserved after so many years of absence. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with cautious wonder. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if she were trying to determine if he was telling the truth. Jack's heart twisted at the uncertainty in her gaze. It was a look he hadn't expected, a look that cut through him with the realization that he had missed her childhood. She didn't know him. She had never known him, and for that he felt like he had failed her. Noah, on the other hand, seemed to be less reserved. He was the first to speak, his voice soft but laced with curiosity. "Are you really our dad?" he asked, his little face searching Jack's for a hint of truth. His words were so innocent, so filled with wonder and suspicion, and it made Jack's heart ache. He nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "Yeah, Noah, I am," Jack replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm here now, and I want to get to know you both." Sarah and Noah exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. Jack couldn't help but notice how their bond was already so strong, how they relied on each other for comfort and security. That was something Jack hadn't been there to give them, and it filled him with an overwhelming sense of loss. But as he looked into their faces, he also saw a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still have a future together. As Jack sat down at the table with them, the tension in the air seemed to shift ever so slightly. It was still heavy with uncertainty, but there was an openness too. The twins weren't sure who he was, but Jack could see that they were starting to soften, to let down their guard. And that was all he could ask for right now. Noah, who had been quiet up until that point, suddenly spoke again. His voice was a little shaky, but there was a spark of humor in it that reminded Jack so much of himself. "Do you know any jokes?" Noah asked, his tone playful, as if he were testing the waters. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was such a simple, innocent request, but it was a moment that meant the world to him. Noah was reaching out, trying to make a connection. And in that moment, Jack realized something. Despite all the time that had been lost, despite all the pain, there was still a chance for them, a chance for him to be the father they needed him to be. "Well, I'm pretty good at jokes," Jack said with a grin, the first real one he'd allowed himself in years. He leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Okay, here's one. Why did the scarecrow win an award?" Noah raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Sarah's lips twitched slightly, as though she was fighting the urge to smile. "Because he was outstanding in his field," Jack finished, laughing at his own joke. The moment felt surreal, as though a floodgate had opened inside of him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt connected to someone. He wasn't just the CEO of a company or a man lost in the noise of his own success. He was a father, and that feeling, that connection, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sarah's lips finally curled into a small smile, and Noah giggled, clearly amused by the joke. Jack felt a rush of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. It was a small step, but it was progress. The twins were warming up to him. They weren't afraid of him anymore. They were beginning to see him as someone they could trust. As the conversation continued, Jack noticed more and more of himself in the twins. Sarah had his quiet demeanor, the way she observed the world around her with calm and grace. Noah, on the other hand, shared his quick wit and love for humor. It was uncanny how much they resembled him, not just in their features, but in their personalities too. It was as though they were pieces of him that he had never known. But now, in this moment, he was beginning to understand them. And as Jack looked at them, he realized something else too. He had been given a second chance, a chance to make up for lost time, to be the father he had always wanted to be but had never known how. It wouldn't be easy. There would be awkward moments and moments of doubt, but Jack was determined to make it work, for them, for Sarah and Noah. The emotional roller coaster was far from over, but Jack knew this was only the beginning of their journey together, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Hope that he could make it right. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could still build the family he had lost. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Emily, the woman who had once been his everything. The years of separation, the moments they could never get back, all weighed heavily on him. He had thrown himself into his career for so long, thinking that success and ambition could fill the empty spaces in his life. But standing there in front of Emily and their children, he realized how wrong he had been. It was clear now that nothing in his life could replace the love of family, the love he had neglected. His gaze shifted to Sarah and Noah, who were still sitting across from him, quietly observing. His eyes welled with tears as he thought about all the milestones he had missed, the birthdays, the school events, the first words. He had been a stranger to his own children, and that realization stung in a way he had never expected. "Emily," Jack whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I've failed you. I've failed them. I didn't know. I didn't know how much I was missing, how much I had lost until now." His voice trembled as he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I threw myself into work. I thought that would make me happy, that would fill the emptiness. But I was wrong. I wasn't there when you needed me. I wasn't there for our children. I made so many mistakes and I can't undo them. But I want to make things right. I want to be here, for you, for them." Emily stood frozen, her expression a mixture of surprise and guarded emotion. She had heard Jack's apologies before, but this time, something in his voice, something in the way he spoke felt different. There was a vulnerability in him now that she had never seen. His eyes, filled with tears, were raw with remorse, and she could tell that he was finally seeing the weight of his choices. "You don't get to just come back into our lives and pretend it's all okay, Jack," Emily said softly, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. There was a tightness in her chest as she tried to keep her composure. "You don't get to just apologize and think it will erase all the pain we've been through." Jack's heart dropped. He understood what she was saying. He had no right to expect forgiveness, no right to hope for things to go back to the way they were. He had chosen his work over everything, over the woman he loved, over the children he never knew existed. "I know, Emily," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm not asking for that. I need you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I want to be part of their lives. I want to be a father to Sarah and Noah." There was silence between them as Emily stared at him, her heart torn. Jack had always been ambitious, driven and relentless in his pursuit of success. She had once admired that about him, but over the years it had turned into a source of pain. She had watched him slip away, becoming a shadow of the man she had married. When they divorced, she had made peace with the fact that their lives were forever altered. She had raised their children alone, and though it had been hard, she had managed. But now, standing in front of her, Jack was offering something she wasn't sure she could believe in anymore. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself, and when she opened them, Jack could see the conflict in her gaze. She had carried the burden of their broken family for so long, shouldering the pain of Jack's absence. She had raised their children with love, doing everything she could to protect them from the hurt that came with the absence of a father. But now, Jack was standing there asking for a chance to be the father he had never been. Could she give him that chance? Could she trust him again? "I don't know, Jack," Emily replied quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of the years gone by. "You don't just get to come in and be their dad after everything that's happened. They've grown up without you, and they've had to deal with so much on their own. I've had to be both mother and father to them. I've had to do it alone." Jack's throat tightened as she spoke, his heart aching at the thought of how much Emily had endured without him. She had carried the responsibility of raising their children, of giving them the love and support they needed, and he had been absent, completely oblivious to the struggles she had faced. "I know," Jack replied, his voice full of sorrow. "I know I've let you both down. I can never make up for the time I lost, but I want to try. Please, just give me a chance to be the father they need." Emily looked at Jack, her heart torn between the man she had once loved and the man standing before her now, vulnerable and regretful. She didn't know if she could fully forgive him for the pain he had caused, for the years he had been absent, but she could see that he wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He wasn't expecting things to magically heal overnight. He was asking for a chance to prove that he could be the father he had never been before. Jack's voice softened, filled with emotion. "I can't go back and change everything I missed, but I'm here now, and I want to make it right. I want to be there for Sarah and Noah, and I want to be there for you, Emily. I don't expect anything from you, but please, let me be a part of their lives. Let me make up for the years I've lost." Emily's heart ached as she saw the sincerity in Jack's eyes. He was offering something she never thought she would see again: his commitment, his willingness to try, despite all the hurt and pain they had gone through. She had to admit, there was something genuine in him now that she hadn't seen before. His apology was not just words, it was a promise. And for the first time, she could see a glimmer of hope. hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. Taking a deep breath, Emily nodded slowly, her heart still heavy but filled with a cautious optimism. "Okay, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give you a chance. But this isn't going to be easy. You'll have to prove yourself to them, to me, and to yourself. But for their sake, we'll try. We'll take it one day at a time." Tears welled in Jack's eyes as he nodded, a deep sense of relief flooding through him. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be moments of doubt and tension, but he was willing to do whatever it took. For Sarah, for Noah, for Emily, and most of all, for himself. As Emily turned to the twins, who had been watching silently, Jack took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning of the journey. He wasn't perfect. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make a difference moving forward. And that, he realized, was all he needed. This was his chance for redemption. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Jack knew that he was starting something new, something fragile, and he wasn't sure how it would unfold. Every step he took toward rebuilding the relationship with Sarah, Noah, and Emily felt like walking on eggshells. There was so much that had been left unsaid, so much pain, so many years lost. But Jack was determined. This was his chance to make things right, and he wasn't going to squander it. He started with the twins. Their relationship was like a blank slate. He had no history with them, no memories to fall back on. Everything he knew about being a father had to be learned in real time, and it was harder than he could have imagined. Noah, full of curiosity but still guarded, was the first to open up, though it was clear that he was still processing the idea of having Jack around. The boy had inherited Jack's sharp wit, and though he still had doubts, his playful nature shone through. The first time they went to the zoo together, Jack tried his best to make Noah laugh, telling jokes and playfully racing him to the penguin exhibit. It was a small gesture, but to Jack it felt monumental. At first, Noah had been reluctant, keeping a safe distance. But after the third joke, Noah had finally cracked a smile, a wide grin that made Jack feel a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. The tension started to dissolve, and Noah seemed to relax, enjoying their time together. Sarah, however, was a different story. She had inherited Jack's quiet nature, her gaze often filled with a distant sadness, as though she had seen too much for her young age. Emily had raised her to be strong and independent, and Sarah was both cautious and thoughtful, watching Jack from a distance. She was the most reluctant to accept him back into their lives, and Jack could feel it in every interaction. He had no idea how to break through the walls she had built around herself. Yet, there was something in Sarah's eyes that told him she was waiting for him to prove himself. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet and awkward car ride to a local art museum, Jack decided to try something different. Instead of pushing for connection, he gave Sarah the space she needed. They wandered through the museum, quietly taking in the exhibits. He noticed Sarah's interest in the paintings and sculptures, the way her eyes lingered on a particular portrait. Jack, in that moment, decided not to rush her, not to force her to open up. He simply walked beside her, allowing her to take the lead in the conversation, no pressure. It was during that walk through the gallery that Jack had a quiet realization. This was it. This was how he was going to reconnect with her. It wasn't about forcing his way in, about making grand gestures. It was about being there, present and patient. They didn't need to talk all the time. Sometimes just being there in silence was enough. "That's a beautiful painting," Jack said, nodding toward a landscape of autumn trees, their colors vivid against the fading light of the gallery. Sarah glanced at him, her lips barely curling into a smile. "Yeah, I think I like it too," she replied, her voice still soft, but this time there was a slight warmth in her tone. Jack didn't push for more. He knew Sarah needed time, and he was willing to give it to her. Meanwhile, Emily watched it all unfold from the sidelines. She couldn't deny the change in Jack. He was trying. He was making an effort, something she hadn't seen in him for years. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, and there were times when Emily caught herself feeling resentful of the years Jack had lost. But she couldn't ignore the fact that he was making real strides. The man she had once fallen in love with, the man who had been kind, thoughtful and attentive, was beginning to re-emerge. He wasn't the same person who had walked away all those years ago. He was more open, more vulnerable. And it scared Emily to admit it, but she was beginning to see the possibility of something more. Maybe it wasn't too late for them, after all. One evening, after a day out with the twins, Emily found herself sitting next to Jack on the porch. The sky painted with the colors of dusk. There was a quiet between them, a comfortable silence that they hadn't shared in years. The tension from their past was still there, but now there was a sense of understanding. Jack, who had spent years consumed by his own ambitions, was finally realizing that the most valuable things in life weren't the deals he closed or the numbers on a spreadsheet. It was moments like these, moments of connection, moments with Sarah and Noah, moments with Emily. "I've been thinking," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. "I don't want to rush this. I know I've messed up. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I'll be here for as long as it takes. I just want to be a part of their lives." Emily looked over at him, her heart softening. She had always known Jack had it in him, this potential for greatness, not just in business, but in life. It had always been buried under layers of ambition, but now she could see it. She could see the man who had once been her partner, her equal, the man who had loved her and wanted to build a future together before everything fell apart. And as she looked at him, she wondered if there was still hope for them, for their family. "You're doing the right thing," Emily said, her voice low but filled with sincerity. "It's not going to be easy, Jack. There will be days when it feels like we're taking steps backward instead of forward, but you're here now, and that matters." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. There was still so much to rebuild, so much to repair. But he wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time, he was taking ownership of his choices, and this time he wasn't going to back away when things got tough. As the days turned into weeks, Jack continued to spend time with the twins. He took them to their favorite places, arcades, ice cream parlors, the park, and with each passing moment, they became more comfortable around him. Noah's jokes became more frequent, and Sarah's soft smiles appeared more often. There was still some hesitation, especially from Sarah, but Jack didn't mind. He would take all the time he needed. For Emily, watching Jack make these efforts was both heartwarming and bittersweet. She saw the man who had once been so driven by his own ambition, now humbled by the chance to rebuild a family. And in that, she saw the man she had once loved, the man who, despite all his flaws, had always had the potential to be so much more. One afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, the twins curled up beside them, Emily looked at Jack. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude, "for being here." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. "Thank you too, Emily, for believing in me even when I didn't deserve it." And in that moment they both knew. It wasn't just the family they were rebuilding, it was trust. And it was love. Slowly but surely, they were building bridges. Not just between Jack and the twins, but between each other. As the days passed and Jack continued to build his relationship with Sarah and Noah, a new layer of their story began to unfold. Jack and Emily spent more time together, their conversations deepening and moving beyond the surface. There were moments when they shared a quiet meal at the dinner table, the twins playing nearby, and the air between them felt a little less heavy. Jack found himself in awe of Emily's strength, how she had raised their children on her own, never once asking for help, yet always putting their needs first. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily seemed quieter than usual. Jack noticed it immediately, and after a long moment of silence, he asked her what was on her mind. "Emily?" Jack said softly, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup as she stared into the fading light of the evening sky. She had known this moment would come, the moment she would have to tell Jack the full truth about her decisions. But it wasn't easy. The truth about the twins' father, about why she had chosen to keep them a secret from him, weighed heavily on her heart. It was a burden she had carried alone for so long, and she wasn't sure how Jack would react. Finally, with a deep sigh, Emily spoke. "Jack, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've never told you before." Her voice was quiet but firm, as if she were finally allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she never had before. Jack leaned forward, his heart racing with anticipation, not knowing what to expect. "What is it, Emily? You can tell me anything." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "When we divorced, I didn't just keep the twins a secret from you because I didn't want to hurt you. That wasn't the only reason." She paused, her chest tightening as she fought back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I was afraid. Afraid of what you might think. Afraid of what the world might think." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. He had no idea where she was going with this. Afraid of what? Emily's eyes met his, her gaze filled with both sadness and strength. "Jack, the twins, they're mixed race. And I'm Asian. I knew that, if I told you about them, things would get complicated. I didn't want them to be exposed to the kind of prejudice that I knew they would face because of their heritage. I didn't want them to grow up in a world where people would judge them because of the color of their skin or their background. I didn't want them to face the racism I've faced all my life." Jack's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. The pain, the sacrifice, the love she had poured into raising their children, and he had been blind to it. He had never understood the depth of the challenges Emily had faced, especially as an Asian woman raising children in a world that often saw them as different. He had been consumed by his own ambitions, by his own goals, and had never once considered the emotional and societal toll it took on Emily. I never knew," Jack said quietly, his voice breaking as he realized how deeply Emily had suffered in silence. "I had no idea, Emily. I was so caught up in myself, in my work. I never stopped to think about what you were going through, what you were protecting them from." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she held them back, determined to remain strong. "It was hard, Jack. It still is. People make assumptions about you when they see you. And when I had Sarah and Noah, I couldn't help but worry. How would the world treat them? How would the world treat me as their mother? I didn't want them to feel rejected, to feel like they didn't belong. I didn't want them to grow up thinking that their father didn't care, or that they were somehow less than anyone else because of who they are." Jack reached out and gently took her hand in his, the gesture both comforting and heartbreaking. He had never understood the depth of Emily's fears. He had been so wrapped up in his own world that he had never considered how the world might see them. And the thought of his children facing hatred simply for being who they were shook him to his core. "I can't believe I never saw it, Emily," Jack whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I was the one who had it hard, that I had to sacrifice so much for my career, but I never stopped to think about what you had to sacrifice. I'm so sorry." Emily turned her hand over in his and squeezed it gently, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't know, Jack, and I never told you. I didn't want to burden you with it, and I didn't want to cause more pain. But now, I see the way you're trying. I see how much you care, and I wanted you to understand why I did what I did. I didn't want them to grow up resenting me for keeping them away from you, but I also didn't want them to feel different or worse, like they weren't good enough. I didn't want them to face what I faced growing up. I didn't want them to feel out of place, to feel rejected. Jack sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to comprehend the magnitude of Emily's decision. His mind raced as he thought about the prejudice that still existed in the world, how people were so quick to judge others based on their race or ethnicity, and the idea that his own children could face that simply because they were a reflection of both him and Emily tore at his heart. I don't want them to ever feel less than, Jack said, his voice full of conviction. And I don't want them to feel like they're not part of this family. I don't care what the world thinks about them. They're my children, Emily, and I'll do everything I can to protect them from the hate and ignorance out there. Emily looked at Jack, her eyes searching his face for any trace of doubt. But there was none. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the resolve in his voice. It was clear that he was finally understanding the complexity of their situation, that he was ready to stand by them no matter what. For the first time, she believed that he could be the father they needed, and for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to feel a sense of hope. Jack took a deep breath and looked at Emily, his hand still holding hers. "We'll face this together. I'll help you. I'll help them. We'll be a family. And we'll make sure that no matter what anyone else says, Sarah and Noah will know that they are loved and that they are enough." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with emotion as she realized that this was the moment she had waited for. The moment where Jack finally understood the weight of their lives, the struggles they had faced, and the importance of family. It was no longer just about building bridges with his children. It was about building a bridge between them all. A bridge that would stand strong against the forces of prejudice, ignorance, and hate. As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, hand in hand, the future seemed just a little bit brighter. Together, they would face whatever came their way. Together, they would show the world that love had no boundaries, no color, and no limits. The air between them felt different now, less tense, more hopeful. Jack, though still haunted by the years he had missed, was determined to make up for every lost moment. He looked at Emily, her eyes filled with a quiet strength, and he knew she had carried the weight of everything alone for far too long. As much as he had been a stranger to Sarah and Noah, he felt like a stranger to Emily too, but he was ready to bridge that gap. "Emily, I'm not just going to be a father to them. I'm going to be here for you too. We'll rebuild what we had. We'll rebuild this family. I promise," Jack said, his voice filled with sincerity. He took a slow, deep breath, his heart beating faster with the hope of redemption. Emily's face softened, the years of pain slowly melting away. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that things could truly change. The sound of Noah's laughter in the distance and Sarah's quiet voice calling for them brought them back to reality. Jack and Emily shared a quiet smile, a mutual understanding settling between them. They were no longer two people defined by their past mistakes. They were a family, healing, learning, and growing together. Jack never truly understood the depth of racism, not until he began to see the world through Noah and Sarah's eyes. It was one thing to read about racial injustice in the news or hear stories from distant acquaintances, but it was another thing entirely to witness it firsthand, especially when it was happening to his own children. At first, Jack tried to ignore the subtle glances and the barely disguised whispers he'd encounter when he was out with Noah and Sarah. He believed, naively, that the world had moved past such things, that people were more accepting now. He didn't want to believe that his children, his beautiful twins, were being judged for something as superficial as the color of their skin. But as days went on, it became impossible to ignore. It started with small, seemingly innocent moments. One afternoon, they were at a park, Jack, Sarah, and Noah, enjoying a sunny Saturday together. Noah, with his mischievous grin and boundless energy, kicked a soccer ball across the field. A group of children ran to join him, excited to play. But when they got close enough to Noah, their excitement faded into uncertainty. One boy, who had been eager to play just moments before, hesitated and then muttered something under his breath. "No, I don't think I want to play with you," the boy said, almost as if it were an afterthought. Jack was confused at first, not understanding what had just happened. He thought maybe the boy was shy, or perhaps he was afraid of playing with someone he didn't know. But then, Noah's face fell. He stood there, his small shoulders slumped in defeat, and Jack saw it, the sting of rejection. He looked around and noticed a couple of the other kids also hesitating, shifting uneasily, their eyes flickering nervously between Noah and the other children, unsure of how to respond. It didn't take long for Jack to realize what had just happened. He could feel the shift in the air, the discomfort that everyone seemed to be trying to hide. The children, so young and innocent, were already influenced by the biases they were taught, whether consciously or unconsciously. Jack felt a tightness in his chest as he watched Noah retreat to the sidelines, his joy replaced with confusion and sadness. Sarah, standing beside him, held her brother's hand and gave him a small, reassuring squeeze, but even she could sense something was wrong. "Why don't they want to play with me?" Noah asked quietly, his voice small and vulnerable. Jack crouched down to his son's level, his heart breaking. "I don't know, buddy," he said softly, ruffling his hair. "But you're amazing. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not." It was a futile attempt at comfort. How could he explain racism to a child who was only 8 years old? How could he make Noah understand that the world wasn't always fair and that sometimes people would treat him differently simply because of how he looked? But the experience didn't stop there. It followed them everywhere they went. Jack started noticing the little things, the stares when they walked into a store, the way some shopkeepers seemed a little colder, a little more distant when they were around. He noticed the tension in the air when he took the twins to social events, and the way certain guests would glance over at them as if uncertain whether to engage or avoid. It wasn't just strangers, it was people he knew, people in his business world. He had invited a few colleagues over to his home for dinner, hoping to build stronger relationships. Emily, Noah, and Sarah were all there, the evening flowing as usual, but one of his associates, a well-known investor, made an offhand remark that shook him to the core. "Well, Jack," the man had said, swirling his drink casually, "I didn't expect your family to be so diverse." Jack's eyes went cold. It was said with such casual disregard, like it was a simple observation. But Jack felt the weight of it, the implication that diversity somehow made his family less than something to be remarked upon with a tone that was almost condescending. Emily, sitting across the table, stiffened. She met Jack's eyes, her face pale with the realization that she had been right all along. People were judging them. They were judging their children, and they were doing it in front of Jack, without a care in the world. Jack's temper flared, but he kept his composure. He didn't let the man's words show how much they hurt. Instead, he calmly replied, "My family is perfect just as they are, and I'll thank you to keep your ignorant comments to yourself." The man shrugged, unaware of the impact of his words, but Jack's world shifted in that moment. He realized just how pervasive racism was, how it wormed its way into every part of life, from the subtle to the blatant. It was in the comments people made when they thought no one was listening, and it was in the stares, the pauses in conversations, the judgment that he could no longer pretend wasn't there. The sting of those realizations cut deeper each day. Jack couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't pretend that things had changed. He was now painfully aware that the world had not evolved as much as he had hoped, and that the burden of prejudice, of racism, still hung heavily over his family. One afternoon, after a particularly painful encounter at a local event, Jack took Sarah and Noah to the park again. This time, there were no other children around. It was just the three of them. Jack sat on a bench, watching his kids play, their laughter ringing out in the air. Noah was kicking the ball around, and Sarah was running, her ponytail bouncing as she giggled. Jack's eyes welled with tears as he watched them. They were so full of joy, so full of life, and yet the world around them couldn't see it. The world only saw their skin color, their heritage. They weren't just Jack's children, they were seen as different, as other. But Jack wasn't going to let that define them. He was determined to do everything in his power to shield them from this cruelty, to give them the love and support they needed to rise above it. His children would never feel lesser. They would never feel like they didn't belong. He would fight for them, protect them, and ensure that they knew their worth, no matter how the world tried to treat them. "I won't let this be their world," Jack whispered to himself, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll change it, for them." And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose. His work was no longer just about building wealth or success. It was about changing the world for his children, for Emily, and for everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin. He would use his platform, his influence, to challenge the prejudice that still lingered in society, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. Jack looked at his children, running freely in the park, their laughter like music in his ears. The future may have been uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was ready to face it. And he would do whatever it took to make sure his children grew up in a world that valued them for who they were, not for what they looked like. The moment of realization hit Jack harder than he expected, and in the quietest way possible. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany, nor was it a grand revelation. It was the sound of laughter, a simple sound he had once taken for granted, but now it was a symphony to his ears. As he sat with Noah, Sarah, and Emily at the dinner table, the world outside seemed to fade into a distant hum. They were here, together, and for the first time in years, Jack felt complete. "Pass the potatoes, please," Sarah said, her voice light with joy. Noah immediately grabbed the dish and passed it to his sister, his eyes filled with the mischief that reminded Jack so much of his younger self. It was the small moments like these, so pure, so real, that made everything worthwhile. This was what he had missed. This was the treasure he had been searching for all along. As Jack looked across the table at Emily, the woman who had once been his partner, and the mother of his children, he saw the changes in her too. She was no longer the guarded woman who had carried the burden of their broken past. There was warmth in her eyes now, and even a trace of hope. The years of hurt weren't gone, but they were healing. It was clear that Emily was starting to believe in the possibility of redemption, both for Jack and for their family. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. He had a long road ahead of him. The scars from his neglect and his past mistakes weren't something that would simply vanish. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most to him, Jack felt a sense of peace. His heart was full, not because of his financial success, but because of the love he had rediscovered. The love that had been there all along, quietly waiting for him to notice it. "I've been thinking," Jack started, his voice quiet but sincere, "about everything I've learned over the past few weeks. I've spent my whole life focusing on work, thinking that success would fix everything, but I was wrong. I was blind to the things that really matter. Family, love, connection." He looked at Noah and Sarah, his heart swelling with pride. "I've missed out on so much, but I promise you, from now on I'll never miss another moment. I'll be here, for you, for your mom, and for us." Noah smiled shyly at his dad, and Sarah's eyes sparkled as she leaned in to listen. They weren't just looking at Jack as a father who had returned from the shadows. They were seeing him for the man he had become. They saw the genuine love in his eyes, and that was enough. Emily's hand reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. For a brief moment, time stood still. Everything Jack had worked so hard to build, everything he had fought for, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to this, the moment when they were all together, as a family. The following days were filled with moments of growth, both for Jack and for his family. His transformation wasn't just a personal victory, it became a shared journey. They laughed more, fought less, and began to heal the scars of the past. But perhaps the most powerful change was in how they viewed the world. They had learned that love wasn't limited by blood. It was built on respect, on understanding, and on standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. On a quiet evening, Jack, Emily, Noah, and Sarah sat together at dinner once more. There were no grand speeches, no more apologies. There was only the joy of being together, of knowing they had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Jack looked at his children, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This, he realized, was the true treasure. This family, this love. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich, not in money, but in everything that truly mattered. They were no longer just a family who had been torn apart by mistakes and misunderstandings. They were a family that had rebuilt itself, stronger than ever. In that small, quiet moment, surrounded by the people he loved, Jack knew that he had found something far more valuable than any business deal or million-dollar contract. He had found a home, a place where love, acceptance, and hope could thrive. As the night wore on, the family shared stories, laughed, and made new memories that would last a lifetime. Jack, once lost in his quest for success, now understood that the real victories were these fleeting moments of connection. His journey from a self-centered CEO to a man who truly understood the value of family had been difficult, but it had made him the person he was today. Each smile from Noah, each giggle from Sarah, felt like a reward for all the pain, regret, and effort. Emily's hand rested on his, a simple but powerful gesture of solidarity. She no longer saw the man who had abandoned her and their children. She saw the man who had returned to embrace them with open arms. Looking around at his children, Jack made a silent promise. He would never again let the noise of the world drown out what mattered most. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. In his heart, Jack knew the road ahead would still have its challenges. There would be moments of doubt, of difficulty, and even of hurt, but they would face it together, as a family united by love, understanding, and a shared commitment to break the cycle of fear and prejudice. In that moment, as Noah and Sarah leaned against him, Jack knew that this was where he truly belonged.